Hello and welcome to this webinar on strategies for supporting disabled children in mainstream schools. My name is Artemis Sakellariadis and I'll be taking you through these materials over the next half an hour or so. This webinar forms part of the Knowledge Box on Disabled Children's Rights in Education, one of 5 knowledge boxes created for learning and support assistance by the IMAS2 project, Improving Assistance in Inclusive Educational Settings. This knowledge box has been prepared by CSIE, a UK charity that works to promote equality and eliminate discrimination in education. We would like to thank Willow Tree Learning, the Inclusive School Improvement Service, for their contribution to this webinar. A link to their website is in the resources section of this knowledge box. In the first 2 parts of this knowledge box, we have established what disabled children's rights in education are and explored a rationale for inclusion from children's rights perspective. Here we discuss strategies that support inclusion for all, and in the final part we will explore the roles and responsibilities of learning and support assistants in ordinary schools. So here's what we'll do. We will first discuss approaches and strategies for enriching disabled children's learning environment. We will then consider ways of making a school's physical environment more accessible, and we will end with thinking about effective ways to plan, deliver, and evaluate support for disabled children. So first, enriching the learning environment for everyone. Top of this list is to value all children equally and treat each one with the same level of respect. At CSIE, we believe that everyone is of equal value by virtue of being human. Just as gender identity, family, or ethnic background play no part in determining personal worth, so ability, or perceived ability, plays no part in determining personal worth either. It is important to remember that children who have learning difficulties, no matter how slowly they may learn, still feel emotions just like anyone else. None of us wants to feel that others do not like us or do not value us for who we are. And none of us wants to experience disrespectful behavior from others. Disabled children are no exception and deserve to be treated with respect and have a sense of belonging in their local community. If disabled children are teased or bullied, this may reflect underlying prejudice. It is important to help children understand that there are more similarities than differences between us, and to take every opportunity to challenge stereotypes and educate others away from prejudice. Let us return for a moment to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was covered in Part 1. General comment number 4, which clarifies how Article 24 on education should be understood and put into practice, begins with these words. Historically viewed as welfare recipients, persons with disabilities are now recognized under international law as right holders with a claim to the right to education without discrimination and on the basis of equal opportunities. However, as we saw in Part 2, some long-standing practices are so widespread that they appear acceptable just because things have always happened this way. This may make it harder to spot institutional discrimination or to feel the need for change. There is something here about exploring our mindset and making sure that we don't see disabled children as inferior or as of secondary importance, and certainly not as an afterthought, having to wait until everyone else's needs have been met before we can attend to theirs. In this cartoon, the adult suggests that the wheelchair user should wait until the steps have been cleared for all the other children before the ramp can be cleared for this child. The child rightly points out that if a ramp is cleared first, then everyone can get in. Similar situations arise in schools all the time. They don't all have to do with clearing snow. Other situations might have to do with planning a lesson, an educational visit, or a whole school event like sports day. The point is that in any situation where we think about all children, we really have to make sure that all means all. So looking back at this cartoon and keeping the bigger picture in mind, I suggest that there are 2 messages here. First, that disabled children's needs are just as important as any other child's needs. And second, that often when attending to a disabled child's needs can be of benefit to all children. The next approach, which is key to enriching the learning environment, is to have high aspirations for all learners. The current education system places a high value on academic achievement. So sometimes children who are not expected to perform well in exams do not get as much help to achieve, or their non-academic achievements are not valued as highly. CSIE believes in the importance of best outcomes for all learners and of working towards achievement for all children. In the resources section, you will find a link to Achievement for All, a website full of useful advice and resources. Unlike attainment, which is based on comparisons between children, achievement is a relative concept linked to individual circumstances. That said, it is important to remember that some children can achieve beyond many people's expectations. For example, Down syndrome is often associated with learning difficulties, and yet there are adults with Down syndrome who write poetry, work independently, or have a driver's license. When children with Down syndrome enter our schools, there is no way of knowing what their personal potential might be. Perhaps the only certainty is that if we do not expect them to achieve in school, in all likelihood they will not. All the more reason, then, to have high aspirations for all learners. After all, children achieve when those around them believe they can. Another important consideration is to make sure that schools have plenty of opportunities for children to learn from one another. Most children learn from each other during the school day, whether this is during small group work in lesson times or when playing together or dealing with any sort of conflict in or out of class. However, when it comes to disabled children's learning, staff in schools often assume that this is best supported, if not controlled, by an adult. This can deprive disabled children of opportunities to interact with and learn from their peers, which is often helpful because of the different quality of engagement and the potential benefit to peer relationships. Some people may hesitate to follow this advice on the grounds that if one child gives and another receives peer support, this indicates an unequal relationship. These people seem to worry that any child who acts as helper in this way would be missing out on something else while engaged in an activity which only benefits the child who receives their help. We would dispute this on two counts. On the one hand, research suggests that explaining to someone what we know is a good way of strengthening our knowledge. This means that both children stand to benefit from the interaction. On the other hand, children help one another all the time. And when the interaction does not involve a disabled child, nobody seems to worry about who is the giver and who is the taker. The next point to mention with regard to enriching the learning environment is that of promoting self-efficacy and empowering disabled children to make choices or express preferences. This could be something as simple as choosing whether to write in pen or pencil, or whether to use a laptop or tablet, and is primarily about children's own sense of choice. Related to this are the attitudes they may have of themselves as a learner. It is essential that learning and support assistants, as well as teachers, promote an awareness of difference and a culture of celebrating diversity. Children may need to be reminded that there are similarities and differences between all of us, and there are likely to be a lot more similarities than differences between any two children in school. The difficulty is that some differences are so noticeable that others stop looking for similarities and dismiss the person as different or other. Disabled children know that they may not be able to do everything in the same way as their peers, so it is essential that they can see what they can do. It is also important for their peers to understand that disabled people sometimes do things differently, so it may not be appropriate to jump to conclusions about what any disabled person can or cannot do. Last but not least, learning and support assistants can play a key part in establishing a can-do attitude in school. We have already talked about the importance of helping disabled children appreciate what they can do. So here we suggest that assistants discuss with children at the end of each lesson or of each day how things have gone, and encouraging them to pick out what they have done particularly well. Much more than this, however, establishing a can-do attitude has to do with the schools transforming how they organize teaching and learning, and building capacity to respond to the full diversity of learners. In part 2, we saw how schools may sometimes resist developing more inclusive provision on the grounds that this has not been developed before. If the imperative for inclusion for all is fully understood as a human rights issue, then the question to ask is not if a school can include a child from their local community, but how they can do this. We now turn our attention to how the physical environment can be made more accessible for disabled children. The knowledge box on physical and sensory impairment includes practical suggestions and reasonable adjustments that can be made. Here, we'll look at more general ideas that can help all children feel more comfortable in school and, therefore, be in a better position to learn. Many children can find a large school overwhelming and may be confused about where they need to be or how they're going to get there. Others find oral instruction hard to follow and can be lost in a sea of words. So first of all, we will consider a range of ways that visual prompts can be used. A simple way to help children understand the structure of the school day and where they need to be at any moment is to use visual timetables. These include an image for each part of the day, organized in sequence from the start to the end of the day. Visual timetables can be used with a whole class, as in this photograph, or with individual children. In the morning, an adult can build the visual timetable with the children while they describe the day ahead, then refer to this at key moments, especially in transition times. In order to help children find their way around, some schools use a simple color coding system. From the school entrance, colored lines on the ground can show the way to various parts of the school. In one school, a child was helped to find their way around by having colored footprints placed on the floors, showing the way from their classroom to key parts of the school where they had to go regularly. Each year, these colorful footprints would be moved to begin from the child's new class. Another way to use color coding is to use colors to indicate what children have to do first, second, or third in a particular lesson or other activity. Many children find a visual prompt very helpful, particularly when they are learning something new. Once again, we're talking about all children here. This is one more example where we're thinking of ways to support disabled children, knowing that some changes will be of benefit to all children. If you think that the images on this slide may help you remember these points more easily, then you have first-hand experience of how visual prompts can help learning. Another important consideration with regard to making the physical environment more accessible is to have more positive images of disability throughout the school. This is not only about a temporary display of disabled athletes during the time of the Paralympics, but about ensuring that disabled people are represented in a positive and constructive way in all curriculum subjects and in school displays, library books, and other resources. It would be hard for any disabled person to have a sense of belonging in an environment where they cannot see disabled people represented. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, the practice of including disabled children in ordinary schools was referred to as integration. This was deliberately changed to inclusion in the mid-1990s to reflect the fact that disabled children belong in their local community. This is the word we would use if we were talking about including everyone in a school play or a school party. We wouldn't talk about integrating people at such an event, we would talk about including them. So the next important point to remember about making your school more accessible to disabled children is to make sure there's a strong sense of community where disabled children belong on an equal footing with everyone else. In the resources section, there's a link to a blog entry by Beth Foraker entitled "Inclusion Really Does Make Us All Better." It mentions a school where a new child arrived who was a wheelchair user, could not use their arms, and wrote by holding a pencil in their mouth. The blog describes how a strong sense of community was established in which this child became a valued member. And the final point to mention with regard to making disability visible is to celebrate disabled identities throughout the school year. There are some key dates to mark, for example, the International Day of Disabled People on the 3rd of December, the International Human Rights Day on the 10th of December, and, at least in the UK Disability History Month in November and December of each year. It is, of course, important to mark these dates, but it is equally important to ensure that disability is understood as an ordinary part of life and therefore is clearly and regularly mentioned in the curriculum, in school displays, and in other resources. There have been, and still are, many disabled writers, mathematicians, scientists, artists, musicians, and more, and if they were only mentioned during Disability History Month, then disability would not be visible in school in the remaining 11 months of the year. The final issue we will focus on with regard to making the physical environment more accessible is the issue of how to organize support. First and foremost, we suggest it is important to involve every child in decisions of how best to support them. They are the best judge of what they find helpful, and it is essential that they have a say in plans for their learning. Listen to their experience and appreciate their unique insight. You can also ask disabled and non-disabled children to carry out an audit of the school and point out where adjustments could be made. It is also important to encourage and enable peer support, as we discussed earlier in this webinar. When assistants support a child's learning, it is important that they do not get in the way of the child's participation in class. We will explore this in more detail in the next part of this knowledge box. For now, we recommend that an alternative to the one-to-one model of assigning an individual assistant to particular children is to have a small group of assistants working in specific year groups, so that each child is used to working with at least 2 or 3 different assistants. This can minimize a perceived pressure to be actively involved with what the child is doing at all times, which can get in the way of independent learning and participation. It can also minimize perceptions that the disabled child somehow belongs with their assistant more than that they belong in the class. An additional advantage of this model is that it is easier to make alternative arrangements when an assistant is absent from school. Even when an assistant is assigned to a child and spends much time with them, the overall responsibility for the child's learning remains with their teacher. In England, the government has published teachers' standards, which all teachers are evaluated against. Standard number 5 states that all teachers must adapt to teaching to respond to the strengths and needs of all pupils. Other countries which have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities will probably have similar expectations of their teachers. It is important, therefore, that assistants work in close collaboration with teachers when planning learning activities for individual children and evaluating their impact. An article entitled "Working with Paraprofessionals," which is included in the resources section, makes this point very clearly. It also says that teachers sometimes take a step back and let assistants become the main educator of a disabled child, assuming the assistants are specially trained for this, but that in practice many assistants do not have this level of training. Last but not least, we will see in the final part of this knowledge box that promoting independence is at the heart of everything assistants have to do. We suggest that building independent learning time in all activities, even if at first this is only a few seconds at a time, is a useful strategy. It not only supports learning, but also guards against undue reliance on an adult for help. All Means All, the Australian Alliance for Inclusive Education, has on its website a toolkit for educators with a detailed section on the role of assistants. This point is made clearly there, alongside plenty of other useful tips and strategies. A link to this website is available in the resources section of this knowledge box. With regard to planning, delivering, and evaluating support, the most important point to make is that it is not so much what you do as how you do it, which makes the difference. As we will see in part 4, the way in which an assistant says good morning or asks, how are you? Or how are you? Can have a major impact on how valued a child feels, on the quality of the interaction between child and assistant, on the extent to which the child engages with working with this person, and ultimately on their learning outcomes. The image on this slide of the bucket with holes indicates that no matter what you are trying to achieve, little will change if the conditions are not right. For us, this means that no matter how well a session is planned or delivered, the child will not benefit unless they are feeling okay and are ready to learn. Once again, of course, this applies to all children. We will now look at helpful strategies and practical tips to help planning, delivering, and evaluating support for disabled children. I would like us to keep this image at the forefront of our minds throughout this section, as this awareness can be what makes or breaks support which makes a difference. First, we will focus on planning support for disabled children. We have already talked about the need to plan in collaboration with other adults and with the child. Supporting disabled children's learning and development is an ongoing process of plan, do, review, where learning and support assistants work in close collaboration with teachers, the child, and with the school SENCO. In countries where assistants are not directly employed by the school, they are also in regular contact with their line manager. Other adults will include the child's parents, particularly for younger children, and other professionals such as physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and speech and language therapists. It is important to remember that what a disabled child is invited to learn, in other words, the curriculum for their personalized learning, is not exclusively linked to the school curriculum. Learning how to make or keep friends or how to negotiate with others are life skills of vital importance. All children pick up or sharpen such skills in school. While most children will do this intuitively, some children need help with this kind of learning as well. We will revisit this in the final part of this knowledge box. Building on a child's strengths and taking account of their preferences are also key ingredients of effective support. By preferences, we mean what a child is interested in and what helps them learn. A good strategy is to find out what children already know, then find out how they learned it. Most children will have learned a lot by the time they get to school. This may include how to use a mobile phone, an iPad, or other gadget that interests them. So, especially for children who are categorized as having learning difficulties, it is important to find out how they have learned what they already know. And let us not forget that planning around a child's strengths and preferences not only supports learning, it is also a marker of respect, someone took an interest in them and planned something specifically for them. Such a personal touch in planning need not take long and can be as simple as choosing between a teddy bear's picnic or Thomas the Tank Engine when planning support to learn basic language or number concepts. A new application is available for smartphones, which can hold key information about the user who, at the touch of a button, can show others who they are, what they are interested in, what helps them learn, what stops them from learning, and other useful information which they may not be able to express themselves easily. This is called the Ebb App, and a link to it is available in the resources section. The online information is currently only available in Dutch, but we are told that an English translation is in the pipeline. The app itself is organized around images and can be used in any language. Disabled children can be helped to input information about themselves, then show this to others when needed. And the idea of this kind of passport is not new. Children do not need a smartphone to show others essential information about themselves. Now we turn our attention to delivering support for disabled children, still keeping in mind the thought that a child needs to be in a position to learn before we can help them learn. The most important tip here is to make sure that learning and support assistance focus on support for learning rather than support for task completion. Any kind of help which gives a child the answer they need to enter into a worksheet, for example, is unlikely to support the child's learning. As we said before, sometimes the constant presence of an assistant, however genuine their intention to help may be, can become a barrier to the child forming meaningful relationships with their peers. One way to guard against this is to work with small groups of children and encouraging their interactions and relationships as much as we encourage learning. It is also important to make any kind of learning meaningful and relevant to the child. For example, explain to the child what you want them to learn and why this will be useful to them, as well as taking their strengths and interests into consideration, as we have already mentioned. And of course, try to make learning as fun and interesting as much as possible. A good rule of thumb is to remember that anyone can learn a little bit more than what they already know. Structuring learning in small incremental steps can be key to success. If a child is presented with an activity that is too easy, they may not learn from it and are likely to get bored. If an activity is too difficult for them, they are likely to lose interest. At the right level of challenge, however, the child is more likely to engage, benefit from the experience, and possibly enjoy the process as well. I remember working with a young child who could walk confidently, but had great difficulty going up or down steps. We played a game which involved them stepping onto a square mat on the floor, then gradually, very gradually, increasing the height to a slim book, then a bigger book, a telephone directory, until eventually the child was confidently climbing one step and finally a whole staircase. Breaking any learning down into small, manageable steps is a great and very versatile strategy. You can ask the child to do something while offering a lot of support, then gradually reduce your support until the child is managing on their own. At every step of this way, the learning target would be described accordingly. For example, the child will do A when X help has been offered. A good strategy for making a step really small and manageable is to combine modeling, where you show the child what to do or do it with them, with asking them to do a little bit on their own at the end. If they find even this too difficult, possibly because they have already learned to depend on an adult for help at all times, you can help by asking them the kind of questions you would expect them to ask themselves if they were working independently. This is another example of support for learning rather than support for task completion, which we mentioned earlier. One more thing to bear in mind is that when supporting a child to learn abstract concepts such as color, shape, or number, the easiest task is usually to match like with like, then to sort into groups of same items, then to recognize the one named, for example, which one is the triangle, and finally, hardest of all, is to name the property of an item. Asking a child, "What color is this?" may be too much of a challenge if they cannot yet confidently respond to requests to match, sort, or recognize an item by its color. If we ask such questions too early in the learning process, we may inadvertently lead a child to believe that this is too difficult and not worth trying. As children get older and the subject matter gets harder, it is all the more important that assistants plan in collaboration with subject teachers who can advise on appropriate ways to break learning down into small, manageable steps. Giving positive feedback is another strategy for keeping learners engaged and learning as much fun as possible. If a child tries to answer a question and gets it wrong, hearing "no" can be discouraging, whereas hearing "almost" or "I can see you're trying, have another go" can be all that it takes to keep them engaged. Help children understand that coming up with the wrong answer is an ordinary part of learning, and if you cannot praise the outcome, you can always praise the effort, as long as it's genuine, of course. At the end of each session, it is a good idea to find something positive to say so that you finish on a good note and the child feels that their effort is valued and appreciated. Remember, it is not so much what you do as how you do it which makes the difference. Saying, "Well done, you've worked hard today," while your mind is racing to what you need to do next, will send a very different message to looking at a child, smiling and saying, "Well done, you have worked hard today." Another important thing to remember is that some children need more time than others to see the information they have in front of them, hear the question or instruction they are given, process it all, think about what answer they want to give, then give it. The more you know the children you are working with, the better you will be able to judge how long to wait before interrupting their thinking with another question or a prompt. Also, if you decide to offer help, it is always a good idea to ask before giving it. If a child wants to manage something by themselves, it would be a shame to intervene too early and thwart their efforts. One final comment before we move on. The kind of support which learning and support assistants offer can have a number of different functions. Sometimes assistants work with children to help them learn something new, others to reinforce what they have recently learned, and yet others to assess how secure this knowledge is. We will cover these functions in more detail in part 4. For now, I would like to point out that it is important to know which of these functions you are fulfilling to help you determine how much help or what kind of help to offer. Remember also that we all have good days and bad days, and it is important to remain flexible and adapt your approach in response to the child's needs as these unfold from moment to moment. This is not to say that if the child is having a bad day, you will abandon all your plans, although you may occasionally wish to do that. The suggestion here is that you remain acutely aware of how challenging the task appears to be for the child, and that you may need to adjust the amount or type of help you are offering so that the level of challenge is still as you had intended. In the final part of this webinar, we'll look at evaluating support for disabled children in school. As we have already seen, support is a collaborative process of plan, do, review. Assistants work in close collaboration with teachers and with their managers to note progress and achievements and to address any barriers to learning and participation as these arise. Parents and other professionals are also part of the plan and review process, though perhaps not so closely involved on a day-to-day basis. As we have also said, it is important to keep the child central in this process, especially when identifying next steps and action to take. Involving the child in monitoring progress can be very powerful, as they get to see and celebrate their success, and this in turn can help keep them motivated and engaged. Years ago, I was helping a group of 7-year-olds improve their reading. We would spend a short while each day learning about reading strategies and putting them into practice. At the end of each week, I would bring a timer and a set of flashcards, and we would count how many words each child could read correctly in 1 minute. This was simple and easy to do, and an extremely powerful way to notice and celebrate progress. An important part of this was that each child was competing against themselves, not against each other, and the child who was the slowest reader was delighted to be the one to make fastest progress. If this had not been the case, we would have certainly found something else to make them feel good about themselves. A key message I have always shared with children is that we can all do some things well and need help with others. And we each need help with different things, and that is fine. It is what makes us unique. And this brings us right back to the importance of involving children in choosing their learning goals and monitoring their own progress. And as we have already established, monitoring and evaluation are not a means to an end. The information is needed to feed straight back into planning the next steps in an ongoing process of plan, do, review. And last but not least, we suggest that you create a bank of ideas that have been tried in each year group, each curriculum subject, or each topic, to help you revisit learning materials and comments on what worked well and what can be improved. Over time, this can lead to a rich collection of resources which you and your colleagues can draw upon. This concludes this webinar on strategies for supporting disabled children in schools. Please remember to explore the resources section of this knowledge box for more relevant information, including useful websites and interesting video clips. We hope you have found this webinar useful, and thank you for your attention.